hello there, everybody. All right, so we're starting our next section here, expansion and imperialism. Um, the majority of these three lessons that we're going to cover this PowerPoint in 3 lessons, and the majority of the 3 lessons will deal with the expansion part of the title, as the United States expands westward, continues to expand westward, something that had started early on in the 19th century and will continue throughout the 19th century into the 20th century. And it's not until probably the last half of the 3rd lesson that we're going to cover the imperialism part, okay, as the United States takes some territories outside of its national borders. Okay, so let's get this going. All right, so the West, and this is where the United States expands to the West. All right, and one of the things that really precipitates this expansion very quickly, a catalyst for expansion in the West, is the Transcontinental Railroad. We've talked about this before. We talked about how difficult it is to move anything from the east to the west across the United States or how difficult it is to do so in a timely manner, because of just how large the nation is. We talked about the trying to ship goods from the east coast to the west coast, and how you got to go all around the southern tip of South America and whatever, until the Panama Canal comes about and really cuts that trip by about 2/3. So now we're looking at interior transportation, and the Transcontinental Railroad is the way it's done. Okay. So the Pacific Railway Act is passed in 1862 by Lincoln, and this is giving shifting some funds to the railroads. Okay, which is also going to significantly shift some economic power to the railroads as well. It promoted the construction of a railroad across the country. All right, and you had two major railroad companies that were working on the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, one started in the west, and one started in the not so far west. Not quite the east, but about middle way of the country, a little bit further west than that. Okay, so the Central Pacific, they would build east. Okay, they started in the west, and they would build east using primarily Chinese labor. Okay, the Union Pacific, they would build west using Irish labor. So you see the importance of the role that immigrants play in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, those two lines would then meet in Promontory Point, Utah. You need to know that for the quiz, for sure. Accident and disease disabled and killed thousands every year. Building the railroads was dangerous work, especially when you're in the like the Rocky Mountain West, that area where there's just a lot of mountains to kind of tunnel through and stuff, and the use of explosives in order to do that was not an easy task. All right, so the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1868. The Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroads met in Promontory Point, Utah, and laid the Golden Spike. So the Golden Spike signifies the meeting point, where the tracks meet. Okay, they laid that Golden Spike, and that's in Promontory Point, Utah, in 1868. All right. So in their race to build railroads, the Central and the Union Pacific Railroad companies would recruit immigrants, most notably the Chinese, to work on the rails. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad by the Union and Pacific Railroad companies marked a major accomplishment in U.S. transportation. For the first time in American history, East and West Coast were linked by the railroad, making transportation of people and goods from east to west much easier and faster. Now, that doesn't mean that there's one line that connects the East Coast to the West Coast, okay? We already know that there were like a system of railroads all over the East. Okay, we talked about that when we discussed the Civil War. They were more prominent in the North than they were in the South, but there were a system of railroads there. Okay, what this transcontinental railroad did is it connected the West Coast to that system of railways. Okay, so you see here, Sacramento is where this company starts. Omaha is where this company starts. They meet here in Promontory Point, Utah. And this connects all of the system of railways over here in the east. This is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Promontory Point, Utah. All right, so in moving out west, there are already people who have settled there. Okay, we didn't talk about it so much in this class, but you should have covered it last year in your 7th grade history class, and that was the westward expansion, the beginning of the westward expansion in the early 19th century, and the displacement of Native Americans in the United States, pushing them further west. Okay, the Trail of Tears and all of that stuff. Okay, so they were pushed west, they settled west, and now Americans are pushing even further west and attempting to displace them again. So you have this map here that shows you where the Plains Indians lived. Okay, nomadic lifestyle moved from place to place following food supply. Warfare among tribes, they battled each other trying to find food, trying to search for food. Wasn't as much of that warfare prior to the displacement, but now more so. Okay, communal living, common use of tribal land, did not believe in individual ownership of the land. All right, so and that was the difference between, and I believe we talked about this with regards to the colonists and the Native Americans. A lot of the conflict surrounded their belief of ownership and property ownership and land ownership and things. Colonists, and this is very much a Western ideal, is that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and part of that pursuit of happiness is land ownership, property ownership, and you can buy land, you buy a plot of land, build a house, raise a family, and grow old, and that's your contribution to the family, is this land this property that you've purchased, that you own. Well, the Native Americans didn't view it that way. They viewed it as though this is everybody's land. Okay, we are stewards of the land. We don't own it. We're not kings of the land. We're stewards. Okay? We're just supposed to tend it and take care of it, and treat it well. But we all get to share in the land, so we don't own it. Okay. So, two key parts of Native American life. Number one, the horse. The introduction of horses by the Spanish in 1598. Later, guns meant that natives were able to travel and hunt. Okay, they didn't necessarily have to follow herds like they did before. They could travel, could hunt, and bring them back. Okay, bring the food back to the community. Okay, while the horse provided speed, mobility, it was the buffalo that provided for basic needs. Buffalo was the key to survival, and you need to remember that for the quiz. The buffalo was the key to survival for the Native Americans. They used every part of the buffalo for food, clothing, shelter, weapons. Okay, and we'll look at some of the ways that they used the buffalo. So, food, obviously. Okay. Secondly, the skull of the buffalo was considered sacred and was used in many Native American rituals. The horns were carved into bowls and spoons. The bones of the buffalo were made into hide scrapers, tool handles, sled runners, and hoe blades. So they would use them for farming. They would use it to move things. use it to make tools. The hooves were ground up and used as glue, used as an adhesive. Which, if you didn't know, glue, as you know, glue that we use in school, unless it's synthetic, if it's made naturally, it's made using horse hooves. Okay, so same thing, same way. All right, the hide was by far the most precious part of the buffalo. Native American clothing, teepees, and even arrow shields were made from buffalo hide. So they used everything. It's very important was the buffalo. Okay, family life on the plains. Small extended families were the norm. Men were hunters while women helped butcher the game and prepare it, and they tended the homes and would gather the vegetables and things like that. Tribes were very spiritual. Land was communal, as I said before. It's owned by the community, or it's not owned by the community, it's used by the community. Right? It's the use of the horse when hunting the buffalo. Buffalo, of course, is a herd animal, so it traveled in herds. And sometimes they would do things like this, or they would hunt them and try to funnel them to where they would run off the cliff and die. Okay. And buffalo are really big. Okay. Really big. And so they provide a lot of food. Can feed a lot of people for a long time, just one buffalo. So a number of them, they would certainly sustain a tribe for a great period of time. Okay. All right, so settlers continued to push westward, staking claim. There are gold rushes that take place, and they're just continuing to push forward, trying to find, trying to carve out a little piece of life for themselves. You know, trying to get fame and just well, more so prosperity, and just wanting to have their own kind of stuff, you know, their own land, their own home, raise their family on this property and stuff. So white settlers who pushed westward had a different idea about land ownership, as we talked before. Concluding that the plains were unsettled, thousands advanced to claim land. Gold was discovered in Colorado. That only intensified the rush for land. It's also going to be, we'll talk about the Black Hills in South Dakota, how it's discovered there later on. Government restricts natives. As more and more settlers head west, the U.S. government increasingly protected their interest. Okay, they had already pushed Native Americans out of the east, pushed them west, and said, you know, you can go settle out there. Now they're pushing out there. They're finding gold. They're finding, they're settling in certain areas across the west, and they're just like, okay, now you got to go further west, or you know what? We're going to create these little areas, and you got to live within these areas. Okay, they're called reservations. We'll get to that in a moment. Railroad companies also influence government decisions. So now we talked about the shift of funds to railroad companies, and with that comes the shift of power as well. And railroad companies had a lot of influence because of the money that they were able to wield and generate once that transcontinental railroad was finished. So they were able to really heavily influence government decisions. Railroads greatly impacted Native American lives. And we talked about the most important resource for Native Americans was the buffalo. Okay, and railroads impacted the lives of the buffalo, which will then impact the lives of the Native Americans. Okay, 1834, government set aside all of the Great Plains as Indian lands. I say 1834. In the 1850s, the government shifts their policy, giving natives much smaller lands, okay, restricting those land grants. Government took away hunting grounds and began to massacre the buffalo. And this was a concerted effort to subdue the Native Americans. And this wasn't just accidental. At first it was, okay? But then they realized how important the buffalo were to the Native Americans and felt like, if we can wipe out the buffalo population, then we can subdue or significantly decrease the Native American population. A lot of broken treaties going on during this time. Okay, so treaties were broken. Indians were forced onto reservations. So the Plains Indians are like, no, we need the plains. The U.S. government says, yeah, we need the plains. So you live on these reservations, so these small areas. But what about the buffalo? Well, there are no buffalo, so you don't need the buffalo anymore. You can live here, and again, the U.S. government is looking at it as though from their mindset and how they perceive things. You get land, okay, but the Native Americans are like, but our way of life is hunting buffalo and being able to move around quite freely, across this wide expanse of land. And now you're restricting us. You took away our most important natural resource, and this is not good for us, not good for our people. Government payments and supplies were not delivered as promised. They continued to slaughter the buffalo. They hired hunters to go out and slaughter the buffalo. Buffalo herds, one of the justifications for it was that buffalo herds often ripped up train track and caused a problem for the railroads. And yes, they did. These large herds, they would do that. But honestly, that wasn't the biggest issue. The biggest issue was that Native Americans relied on them, and Native Americans were causing issues with westward expansion. Okay, many American hunters removed the buffalo hides in order to sell them, but left hundreds of thousands of carcasses to rot on the plains. So where the Native Americans used every part of the buffalo, these American hunters, just killed the buffalo, took the hides, and sold the hides. Left everything else, all the other very useful stuff, specifically the meat, okay, to just rot there on the plains. Really quite a travesty. Okay, tanneries paid hunters $1 to $3 for the hides. Hides were sent east to be used as belts on industrial machines, but the carcasses again and other potential uses of the buffalo were wasted. This is from an anonymous United States Army officer. Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. And that's, at first, that wasn't the way they looked at it, but eventually, yes, that was the way that they looked at it. And this, again, was a way to subdue the Native Americans, to move them on. Okay, these are these are buffalo skulls. Okay, which we already said these were the skull of the buffalo was used in a lot of sacred rituals for the Native Americans. And kind of the belief was, take away the food source from the Native Americans and they will be forced to submit and go to the reservations. They'll have no choice. Okay, and that's where we will stop with this lesson. We'll pick up talking about the Indian Wars that took place from 1860 to 1890. That will be lesson 2. Thank you, and have an excellent